Hello, this is John Quinlan. I'm your host of Forward Forum, a public affairs television show that airs on cable access and via podcast and is taped here at the Sun Prairie Media Center. We're very pleased to have our guest with us, Bonnie Block. Bonnie is going to be going on trial this Wednesday. We're taping the show on Monday, March 30th, and on April 1st, April Fool's Day, ironically, she'll be on trial up in Mauston, Wisconsin, for actions that she took to protest the use of drone warfare at Volk Field here in Wisconsin. Bonnie, welcome to Forward Forum.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Bonnie is someone who is retired as an attorney. She worked in family law, also as a public defender. And in more recent years, she's been a leader both as the board chair and as a staff person at Wisconsin Network for Peace and Justice. Also as a past president, something that we share at United Nations Association of Dane County, wears many other hats as an activist and as a community leader. But Bonnie, why don't we start at a very basic place? What got you into this place where you're going to be going on trial? This is in the fine traditions of civil disobedience, standing up for important causes over the years. But what are the circumstances that played out here?
Well, I have been working on peace and justice really since I left my law practice back in 1990. And as a mother and as a grandmother, I am very concerned about war of all kinds. And I'm concerned for the waste that war is. And I'm concerned at the human suffering it causes. And I'm concerned about how in our country, half of our income tax dollars go towards war, past and current wars. And I look around and see all the human needs that are not being met here in this country. And the whole thing does not make sense to me. So back in, I think it was late 2010, early 2011, we found out that there was talk of building a drone training facility at Volk Field, which is about an hour and a half north of Madison. It's near Mauston in Juneau County. And drone warfare for me seems like an even more egregious kind of warfare. It's sort of remote control killing. It's one thing to have armies fighting each other, but when you target civilians, that really seems like a whole nother level. And what we're being told is, oh, this protects our soldiers and it protects us. Well, in actual fact, I don't think it does. And so in 2011, we started vigiling outside the gates of Volk Field. And as often happens, one thing leads to another. So here I am.
So a couple of things to establish. So what actually occurs at Volk Field that you were protesting?
Okay. There's a program of training operators for shadow drones. It's called the RQ-7 shadow drone. They're not armed, but except with a camera. And what they do is they are involved in target acquisition, they're involved in surveillance, and they're involved, as they told us on this open house bus tour, they can triangulate where ordnance is landed. In other words, they know and follow up where the bombs have been dropped.
Yeah.
So they're part of the system. You know, they themselves don't fire the Hellfire missiles, but they are part of that system.
A really important
Yeah.
part of this, and the training occurs right here in Wisconsin.
It does.
So it was something that hits very close to home in
Exactly,
that sense.
exactly.
Yeah.
And we paid 5%, which is not a huge amount of the total cost, but we paid, it was $4.5 million facility.
Okay. And you alluded to, you protested there over a long period of time.
Right,
There
and
was-
in
go ahead.
December of 2011, we started doing a monthly fourth Tuesday vigil outside the gates. This is one of the signs actually, we have signs, on occasion we leaflet, but mostly we just have signs and we stand there as a presence.
And we're seeing evidence of that
Right.
on the screen now.
That's one of the other vigils. We do that once a month. And on several occasions, because we have gotten absolutely no response from anyone at Volk Field, we've tried to deliver a letter, we tried to deliver a war crimes indictment. So when it came up last May that there was an open house at Volk Field, Father Jim Murphy and I were very interested. We wanted to see what this space is like. And so we took the bus tour as part of that open house. And we also, as we got off the bus, it was 7 or 8 other people, but we gave them a quarter-page leaflet, and it had 4 questions. First one was, would you be worried or anxious if you had drones flying over your home? And then it went on to the other questions and said, if yes, maybe you want to call Congress. And the National Guard personnel, we were in the parking lot of the National Guard Museum, and immediately the National Guard people came and said, that's propaganda, you can't do that here. And we said, well, this is an open house, it's public space, and we're not disturbing anyone. All the people on the bus had already gone into the museum, so we're in a parking lot with military personnel and base security.
Right.
And they're telling us we have to go. But there was no way to leave because we had no map, we had no directions, we had no escort, and we had no vehicle. So my defense to this charge of trespassing is that I entered by permission and I remained because I had no alternative. You know, there was no way I could get off the base by myself.
So there are all these interesting questions that flow out of this in terms of legal rights and the traditions of standing up to unjust laws, unjust practices by our government. That's something that goes back decades. Having
Yes.
just returned from Selma, I certainly saw evidence
Exactly.
of there that
Yeah.
bore some great fruit, even though the state-sanctioned forces were trying to
Yeah.
put people down initially. It's important to stand up on matters of conscience like this, is it?
I think that's very important. And I see a little bit of a difference between, for example, the civil rights movement, which is such an important part of our history. There, the laws were unjust, and people were objecting to the unjust laws. Actually, the laws relating to war, the UN Charter, which says you can't do a war of aggression and you can only act in self-defense, that's a perfectly good law, but our government isn't following it.
Yeah.
And the international law that talks about you have to protect non-combatants, you can't do targeted assassinations, that's also a good law, but our government isn't following it. So what I do, I call civil resistance. I mean, it's part of that same tradition, but
Right.
it is a way of trying to point out that what our government is doing is not right. And, you know, I think the strongest defense I would have is my constitutional right to free speech in a public forum. And also the fact that we need to speak up when we see international law violated. Plus, just morally, it's wrong, I believe. As a Christian, I feel that you don't go around doing remote controlled killing.
Yeah.
So I can't do that because what the district attorney did was filed a 25-point motion in limine, it's called. It's a mechanism for setting up pretrial orders for how a trial will go. And so I can't talk about any of these things. I can't talk about why I am protesting drones. I can't talk about how much it bothers me that the children are being killed by drones and innocent people are being killed. And so I'm very frustrated because it's not really, I asked for a jury trial because I wanted people in that community to be able to hear what's happening and see what they think about it. And I'm sort of blocked from most of it.
So just to understand the distinction here. So in many ways, you've been operating within the law, and your concern is, again, that folks are placing themselves above the law in the context of the military. So just to back up, about the trial itself, then, you're being placed in this unusual position of being accused of trespassing, but there were circumstances around you being on the base that you believe meant that you weren't trespassing in the first place, but secondly, also provide the very basis for why you were there, and yet you can't bring these things into your
No.
trial.
No, I can't even at the trial divulge the contents of the flyer because the judge had said he will declare a mistrial and impose sanctions.
Do you have a sense that it's the powers that be that are placing pressure on the judge that are, again, a precedent in this system that somehow national security or the military and their concerns always trump regardless of these issues of basic constitutional rights?
Well, it certainly is playing out that way in a lot of places in the country. In Kathy Kelly, for example, who's with the Voices for Creative Nonviolence based in Chicago, she's serving a 90-day prison sentence for having crossed the line at Whitman Air Base. There have been people arrested at Syracuse at the air base there. And there have also been people arrested at Creech Air Force Base. And I don't know. I mean, I think the judge is trying to be fair, but I certainly think the military feels itself above the law. And for example, I had subpoenaed David Romold, is the commander of the air base. I had subpoenaed him to testify about the open house. You know, what were the policies? What was the purpose of it? What kind of publicity did they do? And I did that several months ago. And last week, I received notice that from a National Guard attorney that he was not going to appear because all he has to follow are Defense Department directives, not Wisconsin law. And there is that whole thing. And there's such a power imbalance. I mean, here you had a priest and a grandmother with a leaflet. I mean, how dangerous is that to a military base?
Yeah.
It just, really seems to me that it is, it's not tolerable. It's not how things I think ought to be in this country. I don't, the military should not be an occupying force in our own country.
Well, let's talk a little bit about how this plays itself out in other places. I think we have some footage where how this played out in Nevada at Creech Air Force Base, was it?
Mm-hmm.
And so very often a person that is protesting this is standing up to folks who are doing security, as you can see here.
Right. Yeah, this was an effort nationally they called it Close Down Creech. And people were arrested. As I said, the same thing has happened in Syracuse, New York. They regularly go to the base there. My favorite one there was they recently blocked the front gates with 8-foot-high books, and they called it Educating the Base. And it was books about drone warfare. But you can see there's always sort of lots of police officers or sheriffs, depending on what jurisdiction you're in, and they will come and they will, they're sort of no nonsense. This last time they called, base security called the sheriff, and we were handcuffed, arrested.
I just want to interrupt you briefly, but
Yeah,
we're seeing some depictions here
Yes.
through art of the effects on children. 2 points off of this, the folks that were
Yes.
involved with those protests obviously weren't exactly threatening people. They were grandmothers, many of them like you. But I think this is a good time to say again, a lot of what drives you and drives at the other people that we're seeing here, I think
Yes.
is just a notion of what if this were my grandchildren, or
Precisely.
how does this affect my grandchildren's lives to be part of a system
Exactly.
that carries this out?
And there are various reports from the United Nations, from Human Rights Watch, from Amnesty International, and they point out what's happening to adults, but especially to children who live under drones. They really have PTSD. They are very worried about and very anxious and can't sleep and can't go to school because their parents are too worried about what will happen. And so their lives are being greatly affected, whether or not they ever have these Hellfire missiles come down on them. It's still these planes, these drones, can circle for over 24 hours. So you have this presence, and it might be any minute they're going to kill us.
As I was looking into this, I found a particularly compelling picture that I think we can share, maybe of a young man who is essentially kind of just screaming out of the anguish of having to face this day after day. We see him
Yes.
here. These I think that we have a couple of other pictures to share here too of other children who've experienced the loss of a home. In this case, this is the rubble that remains of a home in the Gaza in the wake of an Israeli drone attack. And I think lastly we have a picture of a young woman who lost her brother, who's organizing a memorial to him that will also include, hopefully, changing policies in a way that children like her brother won't be lost again.
Yeah, it really, what we're doing, I think, is so immoral. We have Predator and we have Reaper drones, and they carry Hellfire missiles. Now, just think about that language. But each of the Predator drones carries 2 missiles, and they do what's called a double tap. First, they drop one, and then when first responders or neighbors come to help, they drop the second one. Now, to me, that is repugnant.
Yeah.
There's also been a recent report, and I think I can't remember if it was from Physicians for Social Responsibility. I read a lot, and so sometimes I don't remember exactly the report. But this one pointed out that for every high target militant that is killed with a drone strike, there are 28 innocent people. You know, we can't call that collateral damage. That's outright killing. That's murder. So you know, I fear for my country because this is not what I think we stand for. And it also makes us less safe because look what we did after 9/11 and how we felt with 4 planes attacking.
Yeah.
And we have done over 500 drone strikes. And so we're creating more enemies. We're not making ourselves safer.
You would have thought that would be a time when we would have a point of empathy, when we might understand
Exactly.
what it is to have war in our midst, and to for our children and for other people we care about to face those risks, but it didn't necessarily work out that way.
No. It was a crime, and it should have been treated like a crime rather than invading Afghanistan, invading Iraq. Actually, that was PSR. They came up with a study that, for example, in Iraq, where we also have been using drones, 1.3 million people have been killed. You know, we had about 3,000 killed on 9/11. I mean, it's so disproportionate. It's so egregious. And just drone attacks, the latest report I've seen is that about 4,500 people have been killed by our drones. That's, again, almost 1.5 times. Not that you want to compare how many people are killed, but there is some proportionality that we ought to, I think, pay attention to. I mean, we have this idea that we are somehow exceptional, and we're the good guys, and we can do whatever we want. No, I don't think we can.
You used the term collateral damage, and I was going to bring that up if you hadn't, because it strikes me as just the kind of euphemism. It's kind of the way we paint something as much more essential or nicer than it really is. We use words. The collateral damage, we're talking about killing innocent people.
Yeah, it's a program of targeted assassination.
Yeah. Well, so that's part of it under the rules of warfare. Even killing a leader of a group in another country or something, that's against U.S. law. It's against international conventions. So there's that aspect of it.
Yeah.
But then when you add in this again, what's euphemistically referred to as collateral damage, it's okay for that second missile to come and wipe out the people who respond to the first attack. It's okay that innocent people die because somehow there's something going on here that justifies the loss of innocent life. I would imagine you don't really think that there are cases like that, right?
No, I don't. I think, the other thing about drone warfare, and we're talking about weaponized drones and cameras with, you know, to make
it's not
that
the technology
weaponized.
itself that's
Right.
evil. You know, taking
Yeah.
an aerial picture of a beautiful scenario, that's fine.
Right,
But
search
when
and
we use-
rescue, I mean, there are uses for drones.
Right.
But I think the fact that we are using them in this way, it's just, it's sort of ratcheting up the level of violence. You know, first we had armies, now we have non-state actors. And now we've gone up another level of we do it from, you know, 10,000 feet in the sky and it has nothing to do with the country we're at war at. We're using them in Pakistan, which is supposedly our ally. We're using it in Yemen, we're using it in Afghanistan, we're using them in Somalia, and heaven knows where else. You know, it's one of those things that is just going to keep getting worse and worse, I think, because there apparently are about 60 countries now that have the capability to do this technology. Right now, it's the United States, Israel, and the UK that are actually using weaponized drones. But, you know, there are going to be a lot of other countries that are going to see us doing it and think, well, if they can, so can we. And I just, that really scares me. That's a very frightening scenario for the future of our kids and grandkids and the planet.
There's so many deeper questions here, and I think one of the things it's clear that you're trying to do is to not have our policies and especially something with as much destructive power as drones have those tools of war being used without questioning the efficacy and the larger consequences. But it reminds me of, as an historian, going back to the days just before World War I. Suddenly, we had all of these amazing weapons, and there was so much talk about technology being our future and that it would make our lives so much easier and the other things. But there wasn't necessarily a lot of questioning about the wider consequences of introducing these technologies. Again, they're just tools. We're the ones who determine whether they can be used for the benefit of mankind or not. So I mean, are those the same kind of questions that keep looping around today?
Yeah, I think because we still somehow think that the use of force is going to make us safe, when all it does is, as I said, it ratchets up the levels of violence, it creates death and destruction, which then creates even more instability and more people who are hurting and lashing out. It really is a counterproductive thing. My tagline is always, it's immoral, illegal, and ineffective because of that. And I just don't think that's the kind of world we want. And I don't think that's how we want to spend our resources either. And yet, it's far away. For a long time, it was secret, or semi-secret at least. And I think a lot of people don't pay attention. Maybe partly because they're trying to survive because of our messed up economy. But there's even that. Some of it's not even just our military anymore that is using drones. The CIA runs the drone program in Pakistan. And there's, in fact, some private contractors that are authorized to use drones. So we've got this system of spending huge amounts of money that are going into the pockets of defense contractors, who then have a very vested interest in making sure we keep having a fight somewhere. And it's just disastrous because, as I said, our own country needs some nation building. And why would we instead spend money on destroying other countries?
It's ironic, anybody who wants to pigeonhole this as some kind of out there liberal cause, the principles that you're invoking here about accountability or about avoiding conflicts of interest, people being able to do things without regard to the fact that they may be doing it out of their own interest, but not necessarily out of the interest of the common good, and doing it on behalf of our government. Those are fairly traditional values in a lot of ways.
Yes, I think so. I think so. And the other thing that I think we don't pay attention to is it's not good for our own troops and our own people.
Yeah.
There's been studies at Creech Air Force Base was the first one, and they found that rates of PTSD were higher for drone operators than they were for people in combat. And I think part of that is that they see what they're doing. The cameras show them what they're doing. And they use this awful language, which I think tries to distance them. Like they call it bug splat. When a bomb drops, people scatter.
Oh, wow.
And how can you call that bug splat? But I think that in some ways a hopeful thing is apparently a lot of military people are starting to resign rather than continue working in this program.
Yeah.
In part because they often work in like 7 days in a row, long shifts, or even 14 days in a row, and then have time off. Or if they have shorter shifts, they're going home from killing somebody to soccer for the kids. And I think military people, we are, I think our last wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, which were in response supposedly to the terrorist attacks of 9/11, we've created not only physical but mental, emotional, and moral injury for our soldiers coming back. So it isn't, I care about what's happening to the people in the countries where drones are being dropped, but I care about our military too.
Yeah.
We should not be asking them to do these things and these, I think, evil things in our name. We need to also speak up. And I tell people at the base when we get a little bit of a chance sometimes to talk to at least the guards, look, you're not the enemy. the enemy is drone warfare. It is this policy that we need to change, and it's not a policy that's worthy of this country.
I think it's an important distinction to understand that someone who works on behalf of peace is not against the veterans, is not
Oh, no.
is not launching words and actions that are somehow going to hurt the people.
No,
that
if
are
we
putting
put
their
people
lives
in harm's way and they've been injured, we are required to take care of them.
Yeah.
You know, we need to make sure that their needs are met. But it's much better if we don't create them in the first place.
Especially when it's unnecessary, when the
Yeah.
pretext for war is just
Exactly,
not legitimate.
exactly.
So, if we could flash back perhaps to that graphic of the drone, I just want to flesh this out just a little bit
Yeah.
further. Again, as we look at a drone, I think
Yeah.
you were telling me in this case, this one almost looks a little bit more like a toy than the ones
Yeah.
that you're familiar
there,
with.
There are all sorts of drones. I think there are several types of shadow drones with cameras. I think the one at Volk Field is slightly bigger than this one.
Okay.
But they range, they're now doing one that is called Global Hawk, which is like a $15 million, absolutely huge wingspan, a huge drone. And so they are different sizes. And the other thing about, technology creep with the drones is that they're talking now about pre-programming drones, not having any sort of operator at a computer screen, but just pre-programming them, and they will go off
Wow.
and do their thing. And Medea Benjamin wrote a very interesting book. It's called Remote Control Killing. She's with Code Pink in DC. It's a feminist anti-war group. She says that about a third of the drones actually crash. They crash either because of operator error, they crash because they've been hacked, they crash because something is there's some sort of malfunction. These are not this amazing. Well, you and I have computers, right? We know
Right.
how computers crash, and that same thing is happening. So it isn't. Again, it's not this pinpoint accuracy kind of thing that we are led to believe this is, and I find that scary too. That this could happen.
Just wanted to come back a little bit to the concept, though, of how it may be affecting the soldiers who are essentially running what appears to be elaborate video games that are programming the drones. And of course, these aren't video games; they have real-world consequences.
Right.
And what that may do to someone. And you think back to the Vietnam War, and I think the trend that you're outlining here is one of depersonalizing the cause and effect of war, that human beings are producing an effect that hurts other people. So if you pre-program a drone, maybe you're not as much complicit or responsible for something that could go wrong, it sounds like. But you think back to those B-52 bombers who were flying over North Vietnam, they were at such a great height that when they dropped those bombs, they didn't have any sense
No.
of what was happening on the ground in response.
Right.
And in some sense, it sounds like, ironically, with drones, because of the video and the ability to see, those are people who are scrambling on the ground. Those are real lives in real villages. That maybe this is a little harder to take, and that it's really cruel, as you said, not just to the people who are affected by the bombs that the drones drop, but also to put people in a position of doing that kind of work.
There's a psychologist who talks about this idea of moral injury. And he says that it happens when you're ordered to do something that is against your values in a high-stress situation. You go ahead and do it, but then you really have trouble living with yourself after.
Yeah.
And, the suicide rates among veterans are huge. I think it's 22 veterans commit suicide every day. There's a reason. We have asked them to do things that are not humane, are not moral. And so that's a piece of it as well. And I think, there's all sorts of things in many ways to protest.
Yeah.
And I sometimes wonder, why I'm putting as much time and energy in this. But I really think that this is another level of dehumanization. It's another level of our use of force to get what we want, and to remain in power. I mean, and control. I mean, I think control is a huge issue. I think it's even a huge issue at Volk Field, because after all, I mean, two people and a leaflet. What could that possibly do to bring Oakfield, to a screeching halt.
And if that's the case, though, they're putting up a lot of resistance and spending a lot of time and energy to keep your message from getting out.
Well, yeah, and it's a control issue too, I think.
Yeah.
But yeah, it has been an interesting experience. I did the last time I've been arrested actually 3 times now. Once a year we tend to cross the line, except this time we didn't cross the line, and this time I think that there was no reason to do what we did because it was a public venue, and we had a right to ask these questions.
Let's just talk briefly about the larger tradition that you're a part of. I know you were making a distinction. In some ways, it's a little different than the civil rights struggle. But we think back to, again, I know you're not trying to put yourself on this plane, but the Nelson Mandelas of the world, but the hundreds of people in South Africa or in the struggle for independence in India or in other places that held democracy as something so precious, that held individual rights as so precious. I don't think we've explained to folks, but one consequence of this trial that's happening this week is you've already decided not to pay a fine. You've decided you may go to jail for this. So if that happens, what will you be thinking about? What purpose do you think is served? How does it resonate with other people who've made that choice in the past?
Well, I do see myself, not like these giants of the nonviolent way of life, but I think all of us, Eleanor Roosevelt had a wonderful line. She said, in terms of human rights, she said, either human rights are, and this is a paraphrase, but either human rights are something that take place in our homes and in our communities and nearby, or they don't take place at all. And so this is in Wisconsin. Mauston is the county seat. Oakfield is in Juneau County. It's part of my state. So it seems to me to be the place where I need to make a witness and really to say, no, this is not right, this is not good, we should change this. And it's such a minor, I think about what's happening to women and children especially, but men also, that are being killed or injured by drones and how their lives are shattered. There's a fine or there's 3 to 5 days in jail, and I'm thinking this is really hardly anything, because I really need to say, no, we shouldn't be doing this, and hopefully that will. I think sometimes going to jail makes the strength of your convictions a little bit more visible, because I think we're all taught, no, you shouldn't go to jail, you shouldn't disobey the law, but there are times when that's exactly what we need to do.
You're part of a group called the Raging Grannies.
Yes, that's one of my other.
That's right. And they go and they do marvelous entertaining and singing.
We take familiar tunes and write new words, and it really is a matter of trying to speak truth to power. And the Wisconsin Coalition to Ground the Drones, which is really our sort of ad hoc group. And we have people actually from all over the state who come to the vigils. It's another way of trying to figure out how we can have a more peaceful world, how we can have the kind of world that we want our kids and grandkids to grow up in.
But in the context of the Raging Grannies, you all were a very active presence during the protests for workers' rights at the state capitol.
Oh yeah, 2011, we were there.
And I still remember the picture of you being taken away in handcuffs and being put into an elevator at the state capitol. And of course, you can't help, Bonnie, you are many things, and I don't want to put you in a box, but you're a grandma at base. So what is the extra aspect of you being a grandmother who's willing to be arrested or willing to take a stand like these things?
Well, I think being a grandmother means you're an elderly woman, and I am, and I have nothing to lose. I'm retired, so I don't have a job to lose. I have friends who stand by me. Most of all, I have grandchildren that I care a whole lot about. So this is the time of the life I can do that. I'm able to do it. I can still carry a sign. I can still, testify in court. I can still sing. So I can do these things, and I think I should. And besides that, I think it's very meaningful. I think when we are part of a movement for justice or a movement for peace or human rights, I think that's important, and I think that gives meaning. So, yeah, that's that's why I do it.
So if I may ask, how is this playing out in your family? How does your husband, your children, your grandchildren feel about the fact that grandma might be going to jail for this?
Well, my husband is very supportive. You know, he would not do this, but he supports me in doing it. My son, one of my sons is an immigration lawyer, and he knows about what's going on, and he's very supportive. In fact, he came to visit and is going to sit in on the trial. I have an 18-year-old grandson, and he texted and said, "You go, Grandma." And then I have another son who, this is not his style, you know. I mean, I don't think he opposes it, but it's not, you know, it's not what he does. He's got a young family, he's busy, you know, he's
Right.
living his life. And the rest of the extended family are mixed. Some are very much in favor, and others are thinking, "Oh, come on." So it's kind of like the general public in a lot of ways.
Right.
I know that some people think this is sort of being Don Quixote, but and tilting at windmills. But
It's something you felt like you had to do, it sounds
yeah,
like.
yeah, I do, and I think it's important. And I think ultimately, if humanity is to survive, we really need to abolish war.
Yeah.
I'm so hopeful because, you know, the whole issue of climate change is a major issue and a threat, I think, to humanity. And I just keep thinking, what if we couldn't rally around that and see the enemy as climate change and really focus our energy and our resources on that? But instead, we do all this, you know, war making, and a lot of that actually is over the issue of oil and, you know, the fossil fuel and, you know, that whole batch of stuff that is creating the climate change possibilities. I mean, everything is connected. It's all part of a larger thing.
It's interesting to bring up climate change. As you know, I was in New York in February for a gathering at the United Nations, this group, the United Nations Association that we've both been a part of. And one of the most powerful parts of that day is on the panel about climate change. They showed a video of a young woman. I can't remember where she was, but somewhere in the center of the country. She was a 14-year-old girl who just had this adamant stance that what we're doing is hurting her future. If she looks to the year 2040 or 2050 when she'll be in middle age, you know, the policies around climate change are very short-sighted. They're based in greed. And she just called out an older generation. I'm sorry, you have to stop messing around right now. You have to do something about this. But I would imagine, you know, that kind of a voice is something you hear in the back of your head at times. You know, even though you're of retirement age now and you're an older generation, I think the folks I've met who have lived lives and standing up for the right issues and everything, who are now, you know, in your generation, the constant thing I hear is we're doing this for a younger generation. Just the last thought is, you know, at King Day, there was this powerful statement from Diane Nash. I don't know if you
Yes,
remember.
I heard her.
She was talking about the activism that she and Dr. King and others did for generations not yet born. So as you undertake, you know, this stand, how much is it? This younger generation.
Yeah, I think that's a great part of it.
Yeah.
Joy First and I co-facilitate the Wisconsin Coalition to Ground the Drones and End the Wars. One of the things that we try to do regularly is to talk to high school and college groups. We've actually spoken to the Mauston High School social studies classes. And, you know, these kids are so smart and they ask such good questions. And I really think that we need to make common cause with that younger generation because it is their future even more than mine that is going to be wrecked. And you look at the destruction. I mean, you know, Afghanistan, for example, we've been at war now for, what? It was 12 years in Iraq. It's almost 15 years in Afghanistan. And life expectancy is down to 42. It is the number 1 and 2 highest rates of infant mortality and maternal mortality. It is not a good place to live because we've bombed it.
Yeah.
And, you know, it just doesn't make sense. You know, it just in no way makes our lives better, it makes theirs worse, and it ultimately because of the money wasted. You know, we have kids who have huge student loans, we have homeless people, we have people needing food pantries, we have And it filters down. I think the other thing, my other sort of activism is in terms of prison issues and jail. Been doing some work with the talk about a new Dane County jail. And most of the people, not most, 30 to 40% of the people in the Dane County jail are mentally ill.
Yeah.
We have more people, mentally ill people, in this country in jails and prisons than we have in hospitals and treatment centers. What is that about? I mean, we are destroying ourselves for this mythology and for the war profiteers to, to maintain power. And that's not the right kind of power.
Yeah. Just one other thing off of the involvement of young people in all of this. I think there's a truism that sometimes circulates among activists of an older generation, maybe the folks especially who cut their teeth in the activism around the Vietnam War, that younger generations don't get it the way that we do. That hasn't been my experience. That conference in New York, where the 700 people in this room at the United Nations were young people, those young people did get it. Do you have a sense that there are young people that we should be enlisting? And
I think definitely.
Yeah.
I think, yes. I think that there are a lot of young people who get it because it is their futures. I'm troubled, I guess, the most by people in denial.
Yeah.
People who don't want to know, who literally sort of shut down and just don't want to hear about it. And I understand that a lot of people are fighting for survival. And I understand that I guess that's the other thing, when you know about this kind of stuff, you feel compelled to do something. And they maybe don't want to go there either. So I don't think that's the way that things should be, but I understand that there are folks like that.
Yeah, I guess that's interesting about what you're doing too, because you are taking what some may construe as a radical stand. Even some of those family members that have, feel ambivalent about this stuff. Well, that's just really kind of going over a line I'd never go over. But it strikes me the challenge is so compelling because the messages. You're ironically, we're accused of propaganda inside that base, but of course
Yes.
the government engages in propaganda. Right. Folks with money and power, the ones that are pushing wars,
Right.
They have a lot of power to push a message. And maybe sometimes the only way to get a message out is to do something really out of the ordinary, like what you're doing.
Yeah, I think so. I think it is a way of standing up and saying no. You got to just say no sometimes.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
And you meet some of the neatest people along the way.
Tell me about that.
That is another piece of it. As I said, at the vigils, we only vigil about an hour on the fourth Tuesday of the month, and it's the time when folks are leaving the base, the employees and the military people who don't live on the base. And we wave at everyone because, again, they're not the enemy. And most, I would say well over half, wave back. Once in a while we get a finger, and once in a while we get a peace sign. So even right there are people that I think are kind of interesting, and I would love to talk with further. But also we've had people from Newquatch, Bonnie Urfer and John Lafarge, way up in the northwest corner of the state. We've had people from Casa Maria from Milwaukee. We've had people from Janesville. We have people from La Crosse. We've had somebody from the Many Ways of Peace group up in Eagle River. So it's just interesting because as we stand with our signs, we also talk to each other and compare notes and find out what is happening in different communities about these issues and the interconnectedness of the war and of the not having resources here and of how we are perceived in the rest of the world. It all fits, and so really a benefit is also meeting really good folks.
One of the dangers of being out there on an issue, whether it's civil rights or LGBT rights or workers' rights, or issues of peace like we're talking about here, a whole range of things, is that people again are willing to put you in a box, or they're saying essentially, well, you're saying something, but you're only going to reach people who already believe what you believe. You're preaching to the choir. And as I hear you talk, and some of the people you're talking about in those small towns in Wisconsin, or being able to sometimes relate to and wave at, the people who are part of the military as you come into a base, or other things, I don't think you're necessarily presuming to put people in a box? Is part of what you're trying to do is give people the benefit of the doubt when they have a chance to hear your perspective
Oh,
and
yeah,
other
'cause
perspectives?
I think having information and having experiences really colors how you see the world, and I think sharing those is really important because it broadens your own viewpoint. And even if we preach to the choir, and there's this great line about even the choir needs to
Please
practice.
practice. Absolutely.
So yeah, there is that. But well, I think there's just no other way of changing how we view things than talking to each other, than trying to find common ground, than acting nonviolently always, but being very clear about where each of us stands, but reaching out to try to find that common ground. And I think it's there. I think that we could come up with better ways. In the run-up to the 2003 war in Iraq, there was this absolutely wonderful cartoon, and it had several men with turbans, who I think were supposed to be the mullahs, the clerics in Muslim countries, and then guys in suits. And it said, "Give us Osama bin Laden, or we'll send your girls to college." And sending the girls to college would have been a much smarter move, would have brought about much greater changes.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think that whole thing of grandmothers and of women, I think that role is, and I don't mean to stereotype, but I think, again, just because of our different expectations and roles and sort of the whole cultural stuff, I think women are more used to trying to mediate, to try to find common ground, and don't have as much to prove instead of, being the strongest, being the toughest, being the most macho. And so a lot of the people involved in many of these, especially peace and justice movements, are women.
Well, one of the other bigger challenges you face, and I would imagine this drove your decision not just to pay the fine, but to go to jail, is again that need to get the message further out into the world. And if we could just reflect briefly on how this issue has been reported by the so-called mainstream press, and maybe contrast a little bit how it's being seen in this country versus other countries. There's a dilemma. In researching this, I ran across an incident where NBC News had been shown some clear evidence of the abuses of drone warfare, but decided not to run this story. That kind of thing happens more often than not, doesn't it?
Oh, I think it does. Again, I think it's because, let's face it, our media is also influenced by the corporate sector, just like the defense contractors are, the other piece of that corporate sector. And we don't question. I mean, the Defense Department budget has never been audited. I mean, how silly is that? So I think those are some of the reasons we don't report.
That sounds like a sound, traditional, conservative business practice, for goodness sake, yeah.
But the rest of the world knows.
Right.
I always remember this. They finally did hold hearings a couple of years ago in Congress about drone warfare. And one of the young men was from Yemen. He had spent a year here as an exchange student and then gone back home to, I don't remember the city in Yemen, but he was there. And he went back and he was telling him, America's a really wonderful place, and all of the good things that were happening here and the people he met and how good they were. And then they dropped drones on his little village and large numbers of people were killed. He said, what could I say to them?
Yeah.
In a minute, everything I had told them was wiped out. And the rest of the world knows what we're doing. And that's also dangerous for us because we think they don't.
There was a video that I had hoped to play that, for technical reasons, it wasn't going to work today, but it was a young man from Yemen who was 13 who had just lost his brother and his father in a drone attack. And he produced a video interviewing his siblings, interviewing other people in the village, and how their perceptions of America had changed after that had happened. And the tragic outcome of this is a young man himself was killed by a drone a few months later.
Right, I know that story. Yeah.
But again, to bring home that point, we think that somehow because of the anonymity of drone attacks, because they're one step maybe removed from soldiers actually being there and hurling the bomb or carrying out the action, that somehow this is viewed differently, but in a place like Afghanistan or Pakistan or the Gaza, in the case of
Yeah.
the Israeli use of drones, folks don't see it that way. We're really not doing anything to advance our interest in the rest of the world, to be part of the world community, are we?
No, no, we're not. I mean, and that's, you know, the ineffectiveness of drone warfare, I think, is it is counterproductive. It's creating exactly the opposite of what we think it's doing, of making us safer is the argument we hear. But really it's making us less safe because more people really feel like we deserve to be punished for what we've done.
So the big question here that may be impossible to answer, but you're talking about the buildup to the Iraq War back in 2003. It was pretty clear from all the public opinion polls. The American people were really not only skeptical, but very much opposed to this. And yet the powers that be managed to push it through. So why is it that we keep going back into conflict, into war? Who benefits from it? Who possibly could see that there's something good that's happening?
Well, I think who benefits are really the people in power and the military-industrial complex or the military-industrial lobbyist complex. They're making a lot of money. You know, this is huge dollars.
So the Halliburtons of the world, some of these other corporations, that their very reason for being and
Boeing
the very
and-
foundation
right.
for making billions of dollars is that they're defense contractors.
That's correct. And it's coming home to roost in another way. You know, our military, our military equipment is being given to our local police forces. And we now have a militaristic viewpoint on the part of a lot of police. I mean, Madison has a mine-resistant, ambush-protected tank. I've seen it. I've said it.
Oh, wow.
And they're giving them away. It cost us $1.
Oh, my.
And the argument is that and it's been renamed and repainted. It's now a armored protection. An armored victim protection unit, I think is what they're calling it. But it is, you know, we've seen the pictures of Ferguson with this militarized SWAT team, you know,
Well, there's this
tank kind of a thing. So that is coming back to us too. But I think, you know, in terms of who wins, I think it is those who want to maintain power is who wins. Those who want money, those who want, you know, in the federal system of want power. And I think part of it is that probably in some ways those of us who oppose war maybe haven't been as good at the education and showing how nonviolent movements of people really can bring about change. I mean, you look at how the fall of communism and the fall of the Berlin Wall, most of that was movements of nonviolent people. You look at Solidarity, you look at the Civil Rights Movement, you look at South Africa, you look at all of these countries. And ultimately, they work, but we don't have any education in our schools about nonviolent movements for change.
history's often defined in terms of military victories.
Military and yeah, dates of the battles and all of that. So I think a lot of people don't know that this is really a very effective way. You know, India, you mentioned it earlier.
Yeah.
You know, those kinds of changes are actually better because we're seeing now, you know, we thought war would do something in terms of creating peace between the parties in Iraq, for example, you know, or in Afghanistan with the Taliban. All it has done is really exacerbate things. You know, ISIS is a direct result of what we did in Iraq in terms of which side we supported and who got the stuff and the arms we introduced. You know, Libya, you know, we NATO bombing there. I mean, we've done it, and every time there's blowback, there's things we don't intend. But Martin Luther King has this great line about how responding to violence with violence just makes for more darkness in a sky that is already without stars or something like that.
Yeah.
I'm not remembering it exactly, but he's right. You know, levels of violence ratchet, and what you need to do is somehow figure out to ratchet them the other direction.
And I guess to come back briefly to the concept of keeping the best interest of your grandchildren in mind, this could all be playing itself out eventually in this country, which
Oh,
hasn't
sure.
seen the specter of war.
Yeah.
But if drones were used by our police against us, in ways that violate posse comitatus and other things that say that these folks shouldn't be doing things, and if who knows where the world will be 20 or 30 years from now. We could be on the other side of the equation where these are used against us.
Well, right, and you end up having what I think are extremists, non-state actors, who are willing to kill whoever because they're so angry and so despairing and so I don't know what all. But we're really making drones are an instrument that is much easier. You don't need a whole country and a whole military to have a few drones.
So for folks who are watching this, who want to know how they can do more, I know we've been flashing a couple of different
Yeah.
websites underneath your name on the screen. But if someone does want to influence, is it a matter of contacting elected officials, or who do they write to, or what are there ways that they can support you in some of what's going to be playing itself out in these next few days?
Yeah, I think there are things we can do. I think first is educating yourself, and there's the KNOWDRONES.com website. There's also the Wisconsin Coalition to Ground the Drones.wordpress.com, which talks about the local efforts. But I think it is looking. There's Medea Benjamin's book, which gives an overview of drone warfare. There's a more recent one that's edited by Marjorie Cohn. That's COHN, that talks about the problems with drone warfare. I think in terms of contacting elected officials, I think it's important. I know we often feel like it's just this black hole it goes into.
Yeah.
But I think they need to hear that we think we need to stick with our values and not do things based on our fears.
Well, you and I think have found really valuable exchanges that we've had with elected officials.
Yeah.
It's-
And I think a lot of the reason we accept drone warfare is because we're afraid.
yeah.
We've been told the terrorists are coming, and so whatever we do is okay. But we're not looking longer term, and we're not looking at the blowback and the effects of that. So I think that's one thing. I think also just speaking to families and friends and writing letters to the editor. Join us at the fourth Tuesday, 3:30 to 4:30 up at Volkfield. I think even talking with people that we know that are in the military. Unfortunately, it's only 1% of the population, and I say unfortunately because what that means is most of us don't know what it is they're being asked to do in our name.
Bonnie, thank you so much for spending time with us, and we'll hope to bring you back to find out how
Yes.
this plays itself out and everything else. If you could, just in about 30 seconds or so, though, are you optimistic that work like this that you're doing, that people are doing around the country, around the world, will eventually make a difference?
Yes, I think it's the only thing that ever has. I think that it will make a difference. It may be a long, slow thing, and maybe not in my lifetime, but I think that we can't live otherwise.
Absolutely. Well, thanks again so much for
Thank
joining
you.
us. And
This
we
has
thank
been interesting.
We thank all of you for joining us as well. If you'd like to know more about all of this, again, the information's been scrolling down below. You can also write to me at forwardforum@aol.com or contact the Sun Prairie Media Center. Write to staff at sunprairiemediacenter.com or call 608-837-4193. We look for your ideas as we move forward with Forward Forum about programs and guests and other things you'd like to see. And we thank you once again so much for joining us. Have a great week.
Okay.